Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to American Muslims, Uncovering History, Diversity, and Democracy in the United States. My name is Diane Cohen, and I'm the Director of Development and Strategy on the Kids and Education team at GBH. GBH is Boston's public media station and the largest producer of content in the PBS system. In partnership with PBS, we support PBS LearningMedia, a free digital learning platform serving pre-K to 12 educators and students nationwide. Teachers across the country rely on PBS LearningMedia for thousands of high-quality, media-rich, classroom-ready resources. During the last school year alone, the platform reached 15 million users and had more than 75 million page views. We're excited to have you with us tonight for a webinar presented by the GBH Education team, who bring deep expertise at the intersection of history and classroom practice. Tonight's webinar is being recorded and will be sent along in the follow-up email tomorrow. Joining us this evening are Sue Wilkins, Director of Social Studies Curriculum and Instruction at GBH. She leads the social studies work across the education department. Her work includes curriculum development for the U.S. History and Civics collections on PBS LearningMedia, as well as classroom resources accompanying American Experience and Frontline Films. Prior to GBH, she spent more than 20 years teaching high school social studies and served as the Director of Education at the International Museum of World War II. And Zahir Ali, who is the executive producer of the series American Muslims, A History Revealed, which will be the focus of this evening's webinar. He's served as the oral historian at the Brooklyn Historical Society, now Center for Brooklyn History, directed the Muslims in Brooklyn documentary project, and co-produced and co-hosted an award-winning monthly podcast that explored Brooklyn's past and present. His work on Muslim histories in the United States has been featured in multiple documentaries, and he is a 2020 recipient of the Open Societies Foundation's Soros Equality Fellowship for his work on leveraging the power of storytelling and listening for social change. Zahir currently teaches at the Lawrenceville School, where he is the executive director of the Hutchins Center for Civics. And with that, I am pleased to turn it over to Sue to begin our conversation.
Great. Thank you, Diane. Welcome, everybody, again. We're so pleased to have you with us this evening. And hello, Zahir. I just want to thank you so much for joining us this evening, and just want to say what a pleasure it has been to collaborate with you on this work. And thank you so much for producing this amazing series. I think this evening everybody's going to see what a wonderful addition this will be to their classroom teaching. And just can't wait to hear more from you this evening. We have several goals for this evening's webinar. Some are tied to curricular materials and pedagogy, and others are focused more broadly on why including this history in your classes matters, even when I know you have so much on your plate. Here on the slide, you can see our goals, some of our goals for this evening. Of course, we want to deepen your understanding of the historical presence and influence of Muslims in the U.S., dating back to the 16th century to the present. Of course, we're going to show you the new collection on PBS LearningMedia, which of course is free for you and your students to use. We're going to encourage some critical thinking about themes that you probably are already teaching in your U.S. history courses, and you can see them here. We will definitely share some teaching strategies we have for engaging students with the collection. And then Zahir's going to wrap it up with some thoughts about the importance of students learning about diversity and pluralism as core elements of American democracy. So let me turn it to Zahir.
Sure. As we go through this evening, the key question, or one of the key questions we hope that you will keep in mind, is who are American Muslims and how can their histories help us understand the United States past and present? That key question has been, I think, one of the foundational questions that has driven this project. And just to kind of give you a little sense of overview of this project, American Muslims: A History Revealed is a series of 6 short documentary films of about 20 minutes each, exploring the history of American Muslims spanning time, geography, and people from the mid 1700s to the mid 1900s, from the first Muslims to arrive as enslaved people from Africa to the establishment of early South Asian communities, Syrian Lebanese communities, and Black American Muslim communities in the early 20th century. The films are hosted by 3 leading American Muslim journalists who serve as seekers, kind of stand-ins for the audience who are kind of invited along their journey as they go about visiting historic sites, archives, libraries, talking to scholars, talking to researchers, talking to descendants and community members, gathering bits and pieces of this information to collect these elements together to present these histories. And what results is a series that weaves key moments in US history with the unexpected but essential story threads of Muslims who lived these experiences. And this offers us new insight in how race, religion, and nationality are intertwined in the American fabric, especially around the themes of religious freedom, immigration, civil rights, and civic engagement. So that is the kind of overview that has driven this project, again, around this fundamental question of who are American Muslims and how can their histories help us understand the United States past and present. And I think now we're going to show you a sizzle reel to give you a sense of that. Um,
We're all taught about American history in our public schools, but I think it's only really a slice of what America is about.
I'm a history buff, and I didn't know most of the stories that we're telling you on this series.
What do they wear?
I struggled trying to piece together this American and Muslim identity my entire life. I'm really excited about having an answer.
It was the only community that built a permanent mosque.
One of the first times we have an African American owning property in his own name. So
it's amazing.
It's really not surprising that Muhammad Khan would have been injured here.
It's borderline miraculous that he wasn't killed.
Knowing that Thomas Jefferson had a Quran would have been huge.
The United States is not a monolith. It's made up of everyone.
And, I think I want to say a few more things just in terms of what went into making this series. The team, this project has been years in the making, helmed by filmmaker Graham Judd, and has involved extensive research, review of literature, talking to scholars, a range of academics, and attempts to translate, this academic research. These are stories that specialists have known about, and making it more accessible storytelling that can be, accessible to learners. And so I think there are 3 things that are really important that we wanted to make sure we did in this series, and that is, one, emphasize the importance of archives and primary sources in historical research. These are stories that I like to say, the thing I love about history is it happened. These are stories that have been documented, and we go to sources that are contemporaneous to the events themselves. So we're not making this up. This is there, and it demonstrates how important archives are to historical research. The second is, we understand the challenges that teachers, having been in the classroom and teaching myself, we're like, oh, we don't have room to teach anything more. And so what we tried to do was introduce new content into existing containers. We have to teach about the Civil War. We have to teach about the founding of the United States. We have to teach about slavery and the history of slavery. We have to teach about migration and immigration. And so these are existing containers, and we're providing through this series new content, ways to understand these existing containers that we have to cover in more complex, nuanced ways. And then finally, I think, we want to create space for people to think about what other experiences might help us gain a fuller understanding of American history. So those are the three things that were really important for us to keep in mind as we worked on this series.
So
Oh, I
Zahir,
think, oh, this
you're
is still me? Yeah,
this is still
okay.
you. So this is the Muhammad Khan.
Yes.
Yes.
So now we're going to do a little deep dive into one of those episodes or a clip from one of those episodes that is in the collection that PBS Learning Media has. And while you're watching this clip, we want you to think about two things. And we'll put this in the chat. What about this story surprises you and adds to what we have, come to know about America? And how might you use this to engage your students? So, what surprises you and how might you use it? Two questions we want you to think about as you watch this clip. And I think it's about 2 minutes and 43 seconds.
Yep.
That's not about, that's exact.
For Muhammad Khan, the war was over, but a new challenge had begun: to rebuild his life as a civilian. By this time, his wife had arrived from South Asia, and Khan tried to make a living as a peddler, selling beads, baskets, and herbal medicine. All the while, he struggled with the wounds he received in the war and fought for his rights as a veteran, too. Is it typical to struggle to get your pension?
Yes. So they required either direct evidence, documentation that you had served and were wounded and deserved a pension, or were sick and deserved a pension, or you needed a lot of testimony. He could produce neither. He went through a lot of hassle getting this one. So he talked to the pension office, talked to congressmen. He lived in the District of Columbia, so he was in the halls of Congress, knocking on doors, asking for favors, getting assistance. He was what they would consider a great pest, in the sense that he was there all the time. Everyone knew him. They did all kinds of favors trying to get records for him. They contacted the Secretary of War eventually. And they loaned him money. A lot of black soldiers from the Civil War did work in the pension office. And that's who he actually borrowed money from when he would come to these offices. They really felt for him. They knew his struggle was genuine.
Do you think his race factored into his struggle to get his pension?
Absolutely. He received a lot more pushback and had to enlist the help of all these powerful people to assist him.
Khan fought for over 20 years to receive the pension he was due. But the laborious process generated the paperwork that allows us to reconstruct his story. The pages became his history. When he died in 1891, Khan was buried in Cypress Hills National Cemetery, Brooklyn, under the name the Army gave him, not his own. Here he lies among 4,000 other Civil War veterans, white soldiers, and members of the U.S. colored troops. I'm getting goosebumps knowing that we're close. 5009. There it is. John and Mahai, New York. We found it.
So, why don't we take a moment for you to drop in the chat your thoughts on these two questions. What about this story surprises you? And how might you use this material to engage students? And while you do that, I'll tell you why I really like this particular episode. One is that as much as I had studied and learned about the history of Muslims in the United States, I did not know about Muslims who fought in the Civil War. That for me, this was a very new story for me. And this has somewhat of an epic quality in terms of the way that this story unfolds with Muhammad Khan. It is a complicated story, and it is a story that shows how race as a category is unstable and unreliable throughout American history, and continues to be. Muhammad Khan came from, he was Afghan. He was recruited to fight as part of an all-white regiment. At a point, he was separated from his regiment, and he's thought to be Native American. At another point, he's thought to be Black. And so this just shows how unstable the categories of race have been in the United States, and really makes us have that important conversation. The other thing is that the fact that his name was changed, his name was Muhammad Khan, but at the time people didn't know maybe how to render that name, and so the army changed his name. And so this really showed for us the importance of what researchers have to do is read against the archives, and the ways that the archives can silence, erase, or marginalize these stories, or obscure or hide these stories. Because, as you know, if you're doing this research, one of the first things you need to find is these names. And so making the name legible is part of making the stories accessible, and making these histories, um, readable and viewable and listenable is finding these names. And I think finally, the other thing that I like about this episode in particular, and really all of our episodes, is that the episodes that cover the life of an individual person, is that anyone that's doing biographical studies is faced with the challenge of what people call exemplarity, where you are looking at the life of one person, in a sense, because you want to see how their life might be representative of a broader story. But you're looking at this person because they stand out. So how can you be exemplary but not exceptional? And so certainly the life of Muhammad Khan stands out, not just as an exception, but as an example of the social forces and societal attitudes and social relations that his life helps us explore and illuminate. So oftentimes the individual is unique, but their social condition and historical circumstances are not. And so that's how we use a lot of these biographical studies to help us understand the society at the time.
Mhm.
And I see people are, putting in the chat things that stood out to them about the name changing. Yes, this is certainly something that has happened to many immigrants, and how they might engage students who would be surprised about the presence of Muslims during not only the presence but participation of Muslims during the Civil War. So thank you for your thinking, and I hope you continue to reflect on this question.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to speak a little bit now about the resources that we have created, based on and pulled from the 20 to 25 minute films that Zahir and his team produced. And we again, just having worked with teachers for such a long time now, understand that time is often of the essence. So we pulled clips from these 20 to 25 minute episodes and tried to focus on sort of the essential nuggets, to create resources that are even more time efficient for you in the classroom. So that's what I want to spend a few minutes now showing you. And first, just how might you find these resources? So you can go, if you're familiar with pbslearningmedia.org, you could just go to the site. And when you go there, you'll see a search box like this, and you could just type in American Muslims, and that would pull up likely the collection here on the right. As Zahir mentioned earlier, these 6 episodes are so perfectly aligned really to eras and moments in U.S. history. We also have them in several of the eras in our U.S. history collection. You can find them there. But we also have a sort of a standalone American Muslims, a History Revealed collection. And that, to me, is probably the easiest way to go and see everything that we have created. So when you go to that, and maybe Diane can put that link into the chat for you, you will come to this collection page here, and you'll see everything that we have created from Zahir's series. We have an interactive timeline, which Zahir will be speaking to in just a few minutes. And then we have 6 media galleries, one for each of the films. And a media gallery, I'll just click into this one because we're going to take a look at this, is essentially 2 or more, usually 2 to 4 short clips, all related to sort of the same topic. So here you can see these clips are shorter. So this first one, just 1 minute and 52, 4:26. So generally we try to be around 3 to 6 minutes in length, and hope, the hope is that that's pretty manageable for you. So let's imagine that you were going to use this resource with your students. And what I would recommend, if I were you, is first I'd scroll down here to what you would find at logging in as the teacher, the teaching tips. These are for you. These are all structured in the same way. We start with an essential question and the supporting questions. And what we're doing here is trying to make transparent to you, what is the focus? What is the purpose of this resource? What do we think your students are going to pull from the media here? Then we identify the historical thinking skills that we think this media will support. In some cases, you might find with other resources an independent student activity where they're actually practicing one of those skills. Before viewing is sort of all of our recommendations for obviously what we think you should do with your students before you have them interact with the media. In some cases, it's content knowledge. What is the context that they need to have already before they see the video? In this case, there's a background reading that we have written, and this background reading you'll find with all 6 of the media galleries. And I think of this as sort of like a primer on this topic. So if your students really know nothing about Islam, know nothing about Muslims, this will give them a very broad, but I think pretty thorough overview to help, again, center them before they watch the media. Then we always provide while viewing questions. And so for each one of the 3 excerpts, there are some questions. You could have students watch and answer these questions. You could have them watch and then discuss the answers to these questions. Again, this is very adaptable, very much for you to use as you see fit. After viewing is designed for, so now you've shown the media, kids have watched the media, now what? You don't want to just move on, you want to bring it to some closure. So these are suggestions for really class discussion questions. We also have the second background reading here, and this one really looks at this process of uncovering, how do you uncover lesser known stories? What are some of the types of primary source materials that were used in this series to bring this history to light? And then finally, if you want to do even more with this, we always wrap up with a taking it further section with some further activities, and then a reference for students to take a look at the discussion questions. Those sit on the student shelf, and they are usually 3 to 5 sort of more critical thinking questions for you to use. So very flexible. You can use these, as I say, as you see fit with your students, but I would recommend just sort of skimming through the teaching tips first. I would preview the videos if I were you. I would obviously look at the background readings. I think those are really important. And now we're going to watch one of the video clips in this resource. And if I were your teacher in class, I would have you take notes on the while viewing questions. But instead, I'm going to ask you to think about one of the after viewing questions. I think this one here, number 2, consider Jefferson's words, all men are created equal in the Declaration. What examples from the video show that he believed and acted upon these words, and what examples indicate that he did not practice this ideal? Okay, so try and keep that question in mind as you are watching this clip. It's about a 4-minute clip.
So at the very foundation of this country, there was one of the founding fathers imagining Muslim Americans.
Absolutely. He understands that's going to happen.
To think about Muslims as future citizens was a way of imagining a completely new nation that included more than just Christians, particularly Protestant Christians.
Bringing Muslims into the conversation, mentioning them in documents, there's some foreshadowing of the hopes and aspirations of what the country could become.
Jefferson clearly thought about Muslims in theory. In practice, he had little contact. Documents from the time record just one meeting with a Muslim man here in the United States, which took place while Jefferson was president.
In 1805, the first Muslim ambassador to the United States arrived from Tunis. We were in the middle of an undeclared war that Thomas Jefferson had waged against Tripoli. Tunis was an ally of Tripoli. So the Tunisian ambassador was sent to negotiate with President Jefferson. He was dressed in finery of all sorts of brocade, gold, scarlet, and he had a diamond snuff box that was the talk of the town. Whereas a New Hampshire senator who was at this meeting said that Jefferson appeared scruffy by comparison. Jefferson received him at a state dinner that he set the time for at 3:30 in the afternoon.
Well, someone let it be known that Meli Meli is obviously Muslim and it's Ramadan. And Jefferson doesn't skip a beat. He says, okay, then dinner will begin precisely at sundown.
Which indicates that Jefferson learned from his Quran and from other books about what Muslims believe.
And Meli Meli arrives very shortly after sundown, and then they break bread and have an iftar dinner. This is often referred to as the first iftar dinner in the White House, and it's happening in Jefferson's presidency.
Jefferson's treatment of Meli Meli is revealing. Here was a man of power and influence from a part of the world the founders associated with Islam. This made him very different from the many Muslims already living here by this time.
The founders are thinking about Islam and they're thinking about Muslims, but they're thinking about the kind of great centers of Islamic learning and power in what we now call the Middle East. They're not thinking about Muslims who are in the new United States. Thousands upon thousands of enslaved African Muslims being shipped to the Americas.
Many of the places from which people were horrifically taken in West Africa were places impacted by Islam. And so the people who were brought to America, estimates range from thousands to tens of thousands, were Muslim.
There is evidence for the presence of enslaved African Muslims. You see it in runaway advertisements. You also see it in plantation records of slave names. We actually do have a few narratives that have been penned by African Muslims enslaved here, and some of them are written in Arabic.
There's no firm evidence of Muslim presence at Monticello. But this was a plantation where Jefferson, the person who wrote that all men are created equal, enslaved over 400 people over his lifetime.
Okay, let me stop that. Zahir, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say about this particular episode. I just want to get back to the question.
Yeah, I think this question that you posed, which was a question that we posed to the group, was to consider Jefferson's words, all men are created equal, in the Declaration of Independence, and what examples from the video shows that he believed and acted upon those words, and what examples that he did not practice. And I think one of the themes, and I think this is certainly not unique to the histories of Muslims in the United States, but one of the themes that, we know that's part of the American project is the ideal and the practice, and the gap that exists in between, and often who is actually in that gap. And I think that this clip helps set that up, and it's a tension that the ideal becomes something that people will continue to draw on throughout American history to make the point. So we don't want to diminish the importance of the expression of that ideal, but we also want to acknowledge that it has taken work to get that ideal closer to practice. And I think that's something that tension is illustrated in a lot of these stories, right? And again, not unique to the histories of Muslims, the histories of women, of Native people, of African Americans, people of African descent, of other immigrants, right? There's this gap that exists, and so I see some people putting that in the chat as well. And I think, the more that we can make the complexity of American history accessible to our students, I think the better off we are. And what I'm really proud of this series is that we do it, and it wasn't easy to, find ways to walk that line in our presentation.
Great, thank you. I think the last resource we wanted to show you in some detail here is the interactive timeline. It's Muslims in America, 5 Centuries of History. And I know that while I love interactive timelines, it's always a challenge to think about when do you actually have your students engage with it. So here, I know you're going to speak about the timeline and maybe about answer that tough pedagogical question.
Yeah, I look at a timeline as a kind of temporal map. My sense of time and place are very much connected, and I use, language of time to refer to place and language of place to refer to time. But I think as a temporal map, this helps students locate when something happened in relationship to other events, and even themselves. And in terms of size, expansiveness, in terms of the timeline helps establish scale. How long or expansive this timeline is will help us think about how far back, right? And that Muslims are not a new or recent people in the United States. This timeline shows that longer history. And I think the other thing that a timeline can do is a linear representation of density. It shows the cluster of events. When the timeline, when does it get crowded and why? What might be happening to explain the number of events or occurrences around this particular topic in a particular historic moment? And then finally, I think about a map in terms of topography, where the peaks and valleys, and in translating this into a timeline is what are the turning points? What are the shifts? What are the changes over time? And so I think, those are some of the ways that I think people can approach a timeline. Certainly it's just to give a sense, and it's important for us because I teach history, and we just did our commemoration of Martin Luther King, and certainly my parents were alive when Dr. King was alive, right? But for my students, that might be their grandparents or great grandparents, right? So like I was in school in the 80s, where the 60s was like 20 years ago, and for my students it's 60 years ago, right? And so it helps us have a sense of our location relative to these events.
Mhm. That's great. I'm just gonna finish just flowing through here, just so
Yeah.
you can see we bring it up pretty close to the current day here. And then we wanted to talk about, again, here's that background reading, that sort of primer background reading. But this comes with an independent student activity so that you, again, just notice that you can edit this as you'd like or use it as it is. But it is to help students kind of make sense of the timeline and sort of focus on important events and moments and pull out details that we think are important for them to take note of. And I know, Zahir, you wanted to talk about this first activity here.
Yeah, what I like about this activity is that it juxtaposes in history two presidents, right? You have one president, Thomas Jefferson, who hosts a Muslim in the White House, and then you have another president, Eisenhower, 152 years later, who is hosted by Muslims in the opening of the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C., which was a Muslim house of worship. So it's this great inversion that happens. And it prompts us to ask and think about what happened in the space of that 152 years that we go from a president hosting a Muslim to Muslims hosting a president. And to think about what continuities exist in across these histories, but also what differences and what notable breaks happen. And how might we use those two events juxtaposed next to each other to craft a story or a narrative that might, in our minds, explain that. And it also invites us to think about what other events on the timeline we might juxtapose, what other kinds of juxtapositions we might make to encourage students to think about how one event might relate to another. And I think, one of the things about a timeline is it is a linear presentation of multiple experiences in multiple places involving multiple people. So there is a bit of a interpretive work done. Certainly we made selections about what events to put on the timeline. There are events that we didn't put on the timeline. And so, I think it's important, even when we use these resources, to give students a sense of agency, that their role as students of history is also participating in the interpretive work, right? So questions like, when should a timeline begin? How far back do you go? We do this a lot of times with the American history. Is like I ask my students, when should we start teaching American history? Is it with the original population of the indigenous people? Is it with the arrival of the colonists? Is it, and I think similarly here, these are all interpretive decisions based on the story we want to tell. And what might an alternative timeline with the same events look like? What happens if you stack alternative timelines on top of each other? So I think that the timeline is a rich tool. It's a resource, certainly for people who want like a quick reference, like when did this happen? But I think it's also a tool to invite students to think about the work of interpreting the past and the ways that we present the past and how it reflects our own kinds of interpretive decisions.
Fantastic. All right. Let me just move ahead a little bit here. No, there we go. Okay. So Zahir, this is, I think, our last major section
Yes.
here. Yep.
Yes. And so, I think following up what I was saying about timelines, I wanted to kind of touch on four themes that have been really important in how we shape the interpretive work that we did for this series. One, this is not, we would not call this inclusive storytelling. We call this expansive storytelling. This is not about trying to fit the story of Muslims into an already existing historical frame. This is about deepening and broadening and expanding that frame of the narrative to show that America has always been much more than any single narrow story about it. So going from, what people would sometimes say inclusive storytelling to expansive storytelling. The second thing that we really held on to as we worked on these narratives is going from the abstract to the lived experience, that we are challenging the ways that both America and Muslims have been reduced to abstractions. The former, a nation of ideals, the latter, as a figurative other. And so we try to introduce students to American Muslim histories as embodied, lived, and place-based experiences. The next theme that really shaped our work on this series is from contribution to transformation. I think a lot of times when people do histories of marginalized groups or minority groups or even immigrant groups, it's this sense of like, we must prove that these groups contributed something of value to America and therefore validate their presence here. And this is not what this series does. This series certainly looks at the role that Muslims played, but it's really about how Muslims have been part of the transformation of America, and how they have been transformed by the American experience. So a shift from contribution to transformation. And then finally, these are not just stories about how Muslims became American, but also about America's becoming, its founding, its promises, its disappointments, its developments, and the ongoing process that is world making, a process that is impossible without American Muslims who have lived, questioned, critiqued, challenged, and championed various notions of what America is. And as we think about America's becoming, here are some, I think, guiding questions that we think educators and students can use to connect these stories to key democratic principles. The principles of pluralism, of solidarity, and of active participation and advocacy. So, how do these histories expand our definition of we the people and help us understand and recognize that America's religious and cultural pluralism are essential to a strong participatory democracy? The second is, how can historical examples of both exclusion and cross-cultural solidarity teach us about the importance of building democratic communities across difference? And then finally, how do these histories challenge us to understand American democracy as an ongoing process of becoming that requires active participation and advocacy to close that gap between promises and practices?
That last one seems especially relevant these days. Yeah, these are really powerful ideas. And again, just for everybody, all the participants there, just a reminder that we'll be sending you a recording tomorrow, so you'll be able to see this again at your leisure.
And there's, I think there's a question in the chat about posting a link to the discussion questions for the full videos. And I think that introduces the next slide.
Okay.
Where Sue's going to show you where you can find all of these resources.
Yes. Yes, definitely. So while I'm doing that, I know that Zahir, we'd love to hear from everybody in the chat. Like, what is one key insight or classroom takeaway that you will leave this evening with? Hopefully you have at least one. And while you're thinking about that and adding it to the chat, the QR code will take you to the American Muslims collection that I was showing you that lives on PBS LearningMedia. And again, that's where you'll find the 6 media galleries with all the support materials, including the teaching tips and discussion questions and the background readings, as well as the interactive timeline and the student independent student activity that goes along with that. And then we also have the link here, not a link, but the what am I looking for? The URL for if you want to go see the full films, and that will take you there, and you can look at those in your entirety, and they certainly are worth looking at. They're really remarkable. So that's what I had. We definitely have some time for Q&A if folks have questions. You can put that in the chat as well. And Zahir, I'm going to have to ask you to look for those.
Sure.
Or Diane might have seen some as well.
Yeah, I think so people are putting in how they might be using these materials. So thank you. I see someone saying the idea of becoming is something that they're taking away. The resources, the timeline. And just to kind of give you all an overview, so we have one episode that looks at the experience of Muslims and the story of enslavement. We have the episode you saw a clip from on Thomas Jefferson and debates about religious freedom. We have an episode on the Civil War, which you saw a clip in or clip on. We have an episode on the Great Plains and the establishment of a what might be one of the first mosques, formally purposely built mosques in the country. And we have an episode on the experience of African Americans during the Great Migration in Chicago, and another episode on the combined mixed heritage families of South Asians and Mexican Americans in the Southwest. So those are the 6 episodes. And, they cover from about mid 1700s to early 1930s, 1940s. So again, covering like a good range of time and also topics, right? Slavery, religious freedom, the American Revolution, the independence movement, the Civil War, various waves of migration, the Great Migration, the early migrants at the turn of the century, and the debates around migration in the early part of the 20th century about who had access to becoming American. And so I think these are timely themes and topics that, again, new content for pre-existing containers.
Mm-hmm. So not to put you on the spot, Zahir,
Yeah.
but do you have a favorite?
I still like the Civil War one. Again, for the reasons I stated, I do think as we approach the 250th anniversary of America and what I think we will all expect to be a very contested terrain about who's entitled to this story of America. I do think the story of Thomas Jefferson and Omar ibn Said, those are combined in that episode, will be really important for us to complicate any attempts to flatten and simplify, who was envisioned to be part of this country.
Yeah.
I think someone just asked, are further episodes planned beyond these original 6? We do have ideally we have 6 other episodes that would bring us forward from the mid 19th century to today. I don't know how far we're going to get with that. I think we were going to start with like 2 probably smaller videos that tackle some important themes in that time period. But certainly, the more that you all use these resources, the more that you give feedback, the more that we can demonstrate the need for these stories. That will be certainly helpful in us making the case to do more. I see someone talking about growing up in DC. So we do have the story of Mamadou Yarrow, who
Mhm.
was someone who was able to purchase his freedom, if such a thing can be purchased,
Mhm.
and ended up becoming a landowner in Georgetown, DC. Fascinating, fascinating story. His portrait was painted by George Peele, who was an artist that painted many of the leaders and political leaders of that time, of the Revolutionary era America. So you might be interested in checking out that episode.
Mhm.
Charles Peele, sorry. Yes, Charles Wilson Peele. There you go.
Mhm. Any other questions? There's a chat. Great. Well, I think if there are no other questions, oh, feedback form.
I just put it in the chat.
Ah, excellent. Mm-hmm.
We'd love to hear from all of you about your experience tonight and hear what else you'd like to see from us. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. And we hope that this series and these resources enrich and expand, the work that you are able to do with learners.
Great. Thanks for coming tonight, everyone. And if you're in the storm's path, good luck to you all. I think a lot of us are going to be affected.
And you will receive an email tomorrow with the webinar recording and a link to the survey and all of the incredible resources that Zahir and Sue shared with you tonight.